Pope Francis has been laid to rest at his favourite basilica in Rome following a public funeral at the Vatican. Huge crowds and dignitaries from around the world turned out to bid farewell to the first Latin American Pope. Francis was a champion of the poor who aimed to make the Catholic Church more compassionate.
Paying their last respects to the leader known as the People's Pope. An estimated 250,000 people gathered on St. Peter's Square as Catholics prepared Pope Francis for his last repose. Pope Francis passed on Easter Monday after months of illness, seemingly summoning the last of his strength to lead his flock through one last Holy Week. World leaders like Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky were on hand to bid farewell to Pope Francis. Church officials appealed to those gathered to carry on Francis's legacy as a peacemaker.
Pope Francis never ceased to raise his voice and implore peace and call for reason and honest negotiation to find possible solutions. As he used to say, war always leaves the world worse than it was before. It is always a painful and tragic defeat for everyone.
In his 12 years as spiritual leader of the Catholic Church, Francis was known as a reformer, attempting to make the Church more welcoming to marginalized communities, indigenous populations, and the poor. As the funeral procession made its way through the streets of Rome, the throngs of mourners reflected on the life of Pope Francis.
I want to thank him because he taught us how to love the poor more, those who are forgotten. And I want to thank him because he was a good pastor and spiritual leader.
His smile. Pope Francis' smile will stay forever in our hearts. He was always smiling, always positive. We'll really miss his smile.
I will remember when I saw him up close. He was a normal person, one of us. He helped a lot of people. I know that with certainty.
Pope Francis's remains have been interred at the Santa Maria Maggiore Church. And now, the search for the next leader of the world's 1.4 billion Catholics begins.
Chris Townsend is Parish Priest of the Church of the Beatitudes and joins us from Pretoria in South Africa. What stood out to you at today's proceedings?
I think the important thing for me is here's a pastor, as much as he's a global leader, those very simple black shoes, that strong reminder always he's a pastor first. And I think that to me is really what stood out. Amidst the pomp and ceremony, the Vatican's done this many times, there's a lovely simplicity to it. And I think Pope Francis had a big hand in that simplicity.
And so on that note, Francis' legacy, how was he perceived in South Africa?
I think he had a very strong influence on the whole of Africa because of his stance for the poor, for the marginalized, for the left out. And if we have a look at a continent that is poor, marginalized, and left out, we have to admit it's Africa. He also had such strong messaging around the issues of war. And who can forget the Pope who arrived in South Sudan in a wheelchair, then got out of his wheelchair and kissed the feet of the two men who were continuing the civil war conflict in South Sudan. And here's not a TV moment. It's not a couch in the White House. This was a man, for no other reason, getting on his knees and saying, "You have got to make peace." And I think that to me is one of the enduring memories. Here's a man who called this synod on synodality, so that we would have the chance to do as is quite custom in Africa. We do take things slower. So we listen a little bit more. And I think that listening is going to be one of Francis's great legacies.
He also opened the church to an extent to another overlooked group, the LGBTQ community. How is that perceived in your community?
In my own parish, I have many people who are in the LGBTQI plus community, and many of them have said, you know, they're there because Francis has been able to say, "You're welcome home." And I think that's such a powerful statement, is that, you know, we tend, and sometimes the way that the LGBT community is read and published, it is a separate community. These are our sisters, these are our brothers, these are members of our family. Come home. And I think he's had a very powerful effect. I had many people coming to the church in our memorial services who were saying they're not Catholic, some of them not even Christian, but because he had provided the space for welcome. And I think that is quite strongly how we do things in Africa. Let's try and be a little bit more welcoming. Welcome to everybody in the family. Nobody wants to exclude members of their own family.
And now the search for a new pope from Africa?
You know, the beautiful thing is we don't know. Everybody is speculating. Everybody's got their own favorite candidate. We'll wait and see. If it is, I hope it's the cardinal from Johannesburg. He comes from a very, very small mining town, a superman, a wonderful person, very close to the poor. Yes, every single one of those 130 electors stands the possibility. And as much as we might have watched Conclave or watched all the speculation, wait until the white smoke rises. That's the only thing. I hope it is from Africa. It could be a very, very interesting shift in the church, because the church is moving to that funny thing, the global south. But you know what? The church is the church. We'll get in the whole sweep of the leaders that we've had in the last 150 years, they've been the right man for the time. And that's all I'm hoping for.
We will be watching very closely. Parish Priest Chris Townsend, thank you for joining us from Pretoria.
Super, thank you.
And let's talk about the Pope's legacy a bit with Father Patrick Mary Briscoe. He's the editor of Our Sunday Visitor, a Catholic magazine, and Priory of St. Vincent Ferrer, a Catholic parish in New York City. After travelling halfway across the world and being among the crowds of mourners this week, how did you experience today?
It was quite an amazing shift today, because the attitude of Rome had been quite somber, in fact, I would say, until all the young people started to arrive. You see, this weekend had been planned as the occasion of the World Jubilee for Young People, World Jubilee for Teenagers. So there were massive crowds of young people that began to arrive in the city on Friday. And what I would describe as sober and somber became marked by joy and gratitude. So polite smatterings of applause and expressions of gratitude to Pope Francis are certainly some of the signs that we saw dominate this morning's funeral liturgy. Part of the thing that I think is so striking about seeing all of these young people here, especially these young teenagers, celebrating the Pope's funeral Mass, participating in the Pope's funeral Mass, is that Pope Francis is the only leader of the Catholic Church they know. So certainly they'll carry home with them memories today. This is what they have said to me on the streets. They'll carry home memories today that they'll hold dear for the rest of their lives.
And for them, he's a hero. What did Pope Francis manage to change in the church itself, though?
That's an extraordinary question, and a very complicated one, because his legacy is being currently greatly debated. Many progressives have expressed the opinion that Pope Francis didn't go far enough to change particular doctrines, things like women's ordination or certain teachings on human sexuality, while conservatives say that the Pope was too open, too accommodating to other perspectives. So certainly as we begin to see the cardinals discussing who will succeed Pope Francis, that will allow us a greater clarity on how the Church is receiving the Pope's legacy.
And the Catholic Church is the richest, the most powerful organisation in the world. What power does the Pope himself actually hold in changing things from within?
One of the most controversial parts of Pope Francis' legacy is the urgent need to reform the Vatican finances. As you say, the Catholic Church is the world's largest NGO, and there's a great need for increased transparency, for radical reform concerning the Vatican's finances. There are massive debts that need to be overcome. Certainly, the successor of Pope Francis will have to grapple with the ongoing clerical sexual abuse crisis, which continues to royal church leadership. These are two great crises that Pope Francis left unresolved that the future Pope will have to address.
So what sort of Pope does the Church now need as a successor to Francis?
One of the marks that Pope Francis left on the papacy is a kind of affable and approachable style. I think in order to govern after Pope Francis, his successor will have to embody some of that likability, some of that special charism, that special gift that Pope Francis had to give people the perception, give people the understanding that he was indeed very close to them. But also the next Pope will have to have the ability to navigate the Vatican's very complicated governance in order to enact some of these reforms. So we'll have to see a Pope who's very skilled and adept at managing the internal affairs of the Vatican itself.
Father Patrick Mary Briscoe, thank you very much for giving us your time here on DW News.
My joy.
DW's Jack Parrock has been following proceedings from inside the Vatican and is now at the basilica where Pope Francis has been laid to rest. What was it like in the Vatican and now among the crowds?
Yeah, it was amazing. On St. Peter's Square, there was this very poignant moment. I mean, it lasted 2 hours, the best part of 2 hours, the ceremony there. Lots of the Catholic faithful, clearly very emotional, as Pope Francis's wooden, relatively plain coffin stood in the very centre of where the events were taking place, as the world leaders sat around it. The music was phenomenal, ringing out across the square. Many prayers for many of the saints, but also obviously for the soul of Pope Francis. Amongst all of the sort of ceremony that takes place when a Pope dies, it is also a human being who has died, and this was also a funeral, and it was very emotional for many of the people that were there on St. Peter's Square, Ben.
And what about the short private ceremony, the special features requested at his burial by Francis?
Yeah, so after that happened, that coffin, his coffin was transferred here to the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, which is a couple of kilometres away from the Vatican. And it has now been interred in a very short ceremony here. And while all of the world's leaders were there on St. Peter's Square at the Vatican, here what Pope Francis had requested is that poorer members of society were in attendance, a real juxtaposition between perhaps the more ceremonial stuff that happened at the Vatican. Now, also what's quite interesting is the differences between those two churches. If you go inside the Vatican, it's huge. The basilica is cavernous and very high. Here, it's slightly lower. There's a perspective of square ceilings, and it's a much more functioning and practical church. In normal times, if you were a member of the Catholic faithful, you can turn up here, and down one of the side walls there are confessional booths in multitudes of languages, so you can do your confessions. There's a little green light for when the priest is sat in that confessional booth, whether you want to speak in Polish or English or German or Italian, obviously. So where the Pope has decided that he will be laid to rest is where the real action of the Catholic faith happens. People are coming here to practice their faith, not so much just as a symbol of the Catholic Church like St. Peter's Basilica is and the Vatican.
And you mentioned global leaders. Mass was conducted by Italian Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re. Were there any messages to the powerful who were present today?
Yeah, it was clear there was the message of of the fight against injustice that Pope Francis was so committed to, and an anti-war message. And we had many leaders that were there, present, who have big influence on some of the global situations at the moment. Donald Trump was present. Also, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. There's a very interesting image of the two of them tete-a-tete, sat on some chairs, having a discussion about the situation. As we know that they're trying to find a way to negotiate. There's been some conflict there as well. And so, yeah, there was some messaging from the Catholic Church during that. I suppose to be expected. This is part of the religious doctrine of the Catholic Church.
So a pope for peace, a pope for the poor. Now that the pontiff's been laid to rest, the Catholic Church will be looking for a new leader. The time frame?
Yeah, this is where it gets interesting, doesn't it, Ben? Because I think, just to sort of touch on this, it really feels like it's kind of over. Like the funeral happened, the burials happened. This church the basilica here will reopen tomorrow. People will be able to go and see where Pope Francis has been buried and attend it there. And now it moves on. This is a centuries-old historical religious institution, and we expect somewhere between the 5th and the 9th of May, the conclave will begin, where the cardinals will start their process to decide who the next pope is. As we all know, we'd never know how long that might take.
DW's Jack Parrock reporting from Rome.